The house on the edge of West Hollywood was quiet. Too quiet. It had been years since the tragic drowning of Natalie Wood, but the rumors about her former home persisted. Anyone who dared to stay the night would tell you the same thing. Something was off. And it wasn't just the aging walls or the creaking floorboards. Jack Saunders never believed in ghosts. As a real estate agent, he had seen it all: creaky old houses, dark attics, and cracked windows, but nothing prepared him for the chill that ran down his spine the first time he stepped into Natalie Wood's former home. It was a house built with a Hollywood dream: tall windows, a sprawling patio, and a view of the city that seemed to stretch on forever. But as soon as he entered, something was wrong. The air was thick, almost suffocating, like the house was holding its breath. The first time Jack heard the footsteps, he assumed it was just the house settling. But when they echoed down the hallway, clear as day, he froze. They were heavy, deliberate steps, someone walking through the halls, not as a ghost, but as a living person. He took a deep breath and stepped toward the sound, his footsteps muffled against the old hardwood floor. The hallway was empty, the air colder than it had been moments ago. He shook it off. Old houses made strange noises. It was probably the pipes or the wind. But when Jack turned back toward the living room, he saw something he couldn't explain. A flash of light, too bright, too quick. It flickered like a camera flash, blinding for an instant, and then was gone. But the oddest thing? It didn't make any sense. The power was out. He checked the fuses, and everything was disconnected. Yet, there it was, that light, pulsating from the corner of the room. "Just your imagination," Jack muttered, forcing his feet forward. But then the sound came, the sound that made his blood run cold. A faint splashing, like the ocean lapping at the shore, distant but clear. Jack turned to the back door. The patio overlooked a small pool, a reflection of the night sky. But there was no ocean here, no beach. Yet, the sound of water was unmistakable. His curiosity grew, and he stepped outside, the night air cool against his skin. The pool was still, the water calm. But as he walked closer, the sound of splashing grew louder, closer, like something was moving beneath the surface. He leaned over the edge, his hand trembling as he reached toward the water. And then he heard it again. The footsteps, louder this time, rushing toward him from the hall inside. He turned, but the house was silent, its windows staring back at him like empty eyes. No one was there. Jack felt a deep unease grip his chest. The splashing was gone, but something else lingered, a sense of being watched. He backed away from the pool, his heart pounding in his ears. And as he turned to leave, the sound came again, as if it had been waiting for him. Footsteps, followed by the unmistakable sound of water. But no one was there. He left that night, never to return. To this day, those who visit Natalie Wood's house claim to hear those same footsteps echoing through the empty halls. Some say they hear a splash, faint but clear. Others swear they can feel her presence, lingering, waiting. A tragic echo of the night that ended her life too soon, never letting go of the place she once called home. And Jack? He'll never forget the feeling of something following him out the door that night, something he could never explain and never wanted to understand. Days passed, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the house had followed him home. The air in his apartment felt thick, stifling, like something was pressing in from all sides. The flashes of light that he had seen in the house lingered in his mind, almost as if they were calling to him, pulling him back to that place. And then the dreams began. Every night, he found himself standing in the hallway of that West Hollywood house, the air colder than it had been before. The sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor, growing louder, closer. The floorboards groaned beneath an invisible weight, and every time he turned, there was only darkness, until he heard the splashing again. But this time it was different. The sound of water was louder, closer, as if it were coming from just behind him. Jack would turn, but the hallway remained empty, silent except for the echo of that splash, as though the pool had opened up beneath him, pulling him into its depths. One night, in a haze of sleep, Jack woke with a start. His breath was shallow, his body slick with sweat. Her house was on his mind again. He had to go back. He couldn't ignore it. The next morning, he found himself standing at the front door once more. The house was quiet, waiting, as though it knew he would return. The moment he stepped inside, the chill of the place enveloped him. The floors creaked as he walked, but it was different this time. It wasn't the house settling. It was something else, something alive in the walls. He moved through the house cautiously, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. It was like the house was watching him, listening. Then, as he passed the living room, he froze. There, in the reflection of a nearby mirror, he saw a figure faint, blurred, but unmistakable. A woman standing just behind him. Her face was obscured, but the dark, shadowed eyes were clear. Jack spun around, but the room was empty. His heart was racing, his hands trembling. The silence stretched on, oppressive. He took a step forward, drawn to the back door, toward the pool. But as he crossed the threshold, the air seemed to thicken, the light dimming around him. The splashing started again, louder, more frantic, as though something or someone was struggling beneath the surface. He couldn't look away. The sound was too real, too desperate. And then, in the dimming light, Jack saw something he hadn't noticed before. A shadow, barely visible, but unmistakably there hovering above the water. The shape of a woman. She was reaching for him, her fingers just inches from the surface. Her face now clear in the reflection of the pool. The same face, Natalie Wood. But the expression wasn't one of peace. Her eyes were wide with something darker, something angry. Jack took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. The air felt thick, pressing against his lungs. He needed to leave. But as he turned to go, he heard the footsteps again. Closer now. Louder. They were coming from behind him, coming toward the pool. The splashing had stopped, but the footsteps remained. There was a rhythm to them, an almost deliberate pattern. As if someone was pacing, waiting. Jack didn't know what to do. He couldn't run. He couldn't escape. It was as if the house had claimed him, pulling him into its history, its secrets, its grief. The same grief that had haunted Natalie Wood for years after her mysterious death. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went silent. Jack turned, terrified that something worse was waiting in the silence. But as he stepped toward the door, he noticed something strange in the corner of the room, an old phone, tucked behind a forgotten chair. It hadn't been there before. Slowly, Jack approached it, his hand trembling as he picked it up. The receiver was cold against his skin. No dial tone. Nothing. Just the faintest whisper, as if someone on the other end was trying to speak. And then, the words came soft, distant, but clear. "Help me." Jack's blood ran cold. It wasn't a whisper. It was her. Before he could react, the door slammed shut behind him, and the air shifted colder, heavier. He was trapped. The house wasn't done with him yet. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The room seemed to close in on Jack as the door slammed shut. The air was thick with a presence, like someone was standing just behind him, breathing down his neck. His pulse raced, his chest tight with panic. He turned to face the door, but it was locked now, as though it had never been open. The house was holding him in place, keeping him from escaping. Jack's hand still gripped the receiver, his fingers numb with the chill creeping through his skin. He held his breath, straining to listen, but the faint whisper on the other end was gone. The house was silent again. Too silent. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it, the reflection in the mirror. The woman. Her face was clearer now, her eyes wide with terror, mouth open in a scream that Jack couldn't hear. The reflection didn't match the stillness of the room. She was moving in the glass, slowly, deliberately, reaching out to him. Her fingers brushed the surface, pressing against the glass as if trying to break free. Jack's heart pounded as he backed away, not knowing where to go or what to do. Every instinct in him screamed to leave, to run, but the house was holding him captive. He was stuck in this moment, trapped between worlds. He could feel the weight of her presence in the room, as though she were walking behind him, watching his every move. Then the light flickered. Once, twice. And when it returned, everything had changed. The room was no longer the same. The walls seemed to stretch, the ceiling lower. The hallway beyond seemed longer, as if the house itself was warping, transforming. But it wasn't the house that had changed. It was him. The feeling of being caught between time and space consumed him, and he realized he was no longer just an observer. He was part of the house now. Jack tried to breathe, but the air was thick, oppressive. The silence around him was suffocating, broken only by the sound of the distant ocean waves, distant, yet somehow closer. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening, but every answer felt just out of reach, like a half-formed dream fading into the fog. And then he heard the footsteps again. But this time they weren't coming from behind him. They were coming from within. His head spun, and for the briefest moment, he couldn't tell if the footsteps were his own, or if they were someone else's. The pace quickened, the sound echoing in his ears, until it became a full-on rush. They were getting closer, faster. There was nowhere to hide. And then, as if it had always been there, the figure appeared. It wasn't just a reflection anymore. The woman Natalie was standing in the doorway. But she wasn't like the images he had seen before. This was no mere ghost. This was her, but not the woman she had been in life. Her eyes were wide with a deep, unfathomable sadness. Yet there was something else in them, something darker. Anger and fear. A fear that seemed to twist her face into something unrecognizable. A nightmare taking shape right before him. Her lips parted, and this time, Jack could hear the words she spoke. They were raw, desperate. Get out. It's not safe. Jack didn't know if he was dreaming or awake. He couldn't make sense of what was happening, but he knew one thing: he had to get out. Now, he turned to the door again, desperately trying to twist the knob, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged within him. The footsteps were closer now, almost deafening. He could feel them in his chest, vibrating the walls around him, closing in on him from all directions. His breath came in short gasps, his pulse erratic. That's when he saw it. A light, not from the ceiling, but from the back of the room, flickering, growing brighter. He followed it instinctively, driven by some primal need to escape. But as he neared it, he saw something else. A shape, no longer a shadow, but a figure. A man. Tall, lean, and somehow familiar. It was the last thing Jack expected to see. A man who had once visited the house. A man who had disappeared without a trace years ago. David Grant. An old reporter who had been obsessed with the strange occurrences in the house long before Jack ever stepped foot inside. David was standing there, his face pale, his eyes wide and unblinking. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. He reached out toward Jack, his hand trembling. But Jack didn't move. He couldn't. Not when the thing in the doorway, Natalie, was still there. Her eyes locked onto his, as if warning him. He had no time to think. With every ounce of his strength, he yanked at the door again, and this time it opened. But when Jack stepped out into the hallway, the world had changed once again. The house had swallowed him whole, and there was no escape. Jack stumbled into the hallway, his breath hitching as the door slammed shut behind him, sealing off the room and the figure of Natalie. The air here was different, heavier, as if it carried the weight of too many voices trying to speak at once. The hallway stretched unnaturally, its once familiar walls warped and uneven. The house was alive now, breathing, shifting around him. Shadows danced along the edges of the corridor, flickering in ways the dim light couldn't explain. Jack tried to steady himself, his fingers brushing against the cool, uneven surface of the wall. Felt damp, almost like the inside of a cave. He needed to leave, but every step forward seemed to lead him further away from the front door. The sound of the ocean grew louder, pounding in his ears, as if the house itself was drowning. Jack's pulse raced as he moved toward the end of the hallway, where a faint light glimmered like a distant beacon. But as he drew closer, the light shifted. It wasn't an exit, it was a reflection. A mirror, tall and tarnished, framed in dark wood. The glass shimmered, rippling like water, pulling Jack closer with an unnatural force. He tried to look away, but his feet carried him forward, as if the mirror had its own gravity. When he reached it, he saw himself. But the reflection wasn't quite right. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, and behind him there she was again. Natalie. This time, she was clearer than ever, standing just over his shoulder. Her expression an unsettling mix of pleading and anger. Her lips moved, but the words were faint, like they were coming from underwater. Don't let it take you. Jack's heart froze. The reflection shifted again, the surface of the mirror rippling violently. His own image dissolved, replaced by something darker. The hallway in the reflection was gone, replaced by the roiling surface of the ocean. The waves churned, restless and chaotic, as if something was trapped beneath them. And then he saw it, a hand, pale, trembling, breaking through the water's surface. Another followed, and then a face. Natalie's face. Jack stumbled back, his pulse pounding in his ears, but the mirror didn't release him. The image inside was alive, pulling him in. Her hands were reaching for him now, breaking through the surface of the glass as though it had become liquid. Help me! Her voice rang out, no longer muffled, no longer distant. It was raw and desperate, and it echoed through the hallway, reverberating like a scream. Jack wanted to run, but his feet wouldn't move. His hands trembled as he raised them defensively, but the pull of the mirror was too strong. He could feel it dragging him closer, the cold seeping into his skin. Then, the light behind him flickered again. A shadow moved across the hallway, tall, angular, wrong. Jack froze as the air grew colder. It wasn't Natalie this time. It was something else. Something darker. He turned slowly, his breath catching in his throat. Standing at the far end of the hallway was the man, the figure he'd seen before. David Grant. But he wasn't looking at Jack now. He was staring at the mirror, his expression blank, his body unnaturally still. David! Jack's voice cracked, barely above a whisper. The man's head tilted slightly, his eyes hollow and lifeless. Slowly, he raised an arm and pointed toward the mirror. His mouth moved, but the words were inaudible, swallowed by the growing roar of the ocean in Jack's ears. And then the shadow moved. Not David, but something behind him. Something vast, black, and formless, spilling into the hallway like smoke. It crept closer, enveloping David as though he weren't even there. Jack's breath hitched as the darkness expanded, stretching toward him. The mirror began to hum, vibrating with an unnatural energy. The glass shimmered violently, and Jack felt the pull intensify. He clung to the wall, his mind racing for a way out, but every direction felt wrong, like the house was folding in on itself. And then, from deep within the darkness, a voice emerged, low, guttural, and filled with malice. She is not yours to save. Jack's blood ran cold. The voice didn't belong to Natalie. It didn't belong to David. It belonged to something else entirely. The shadow surged forward, and the hallway dissolved into chaos. The darkness surged toward Jack, its edges curling like tendrils of smoke, yet heavy with a presence that felt ancient, unknowable. The hallway around him seemed to melt away, the walls rippling like water, the air vibrating with an oppressive hum. The mirror's pull intensified, dragging Jack closer even as he fought against it. His legs felt like lead, his strength draining with every second. She is not yours to save. The voice boomed again, shaking the very foundation of the house. It was everywhere and nowhere, a sound that clawed at Jack's sanity. But then, cutting through the chaos, Jack heard another voice, a softer, desperate plea. Please, help me, Natalie. Her reflection was still in the mirror, her hands reaching toward him, her eyes locked on his. But now her expression was different. The anger was gone, replaced by something else. Terror. She wasn't trying to haunt him. She was trying to escape. Jack's instincts kicked in. Whatever this darkness was, it had her, and it wasn't going to let her go. The mirror wasn't just a portal, it was a trap, a prison holding her spirit captive. He had no idea what he could do, but he couldn't leave her here, couldn't let her remain trapped in this endless cycle of torment. Summoning every ounce of courage he had left, Jack lunged toward the mirror. His hand met the surface, and instead of the cold, unyielding glass he expected, it felt like ice-cold water. It rippled under his touch, pulling him in. He gritted his teeth and pushed harder, plunging his arm through the surface. The cold was unbearable, searing his skin like frostbite, but he didn't stop. "Take my hand," he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. Natalie's face lit up with recognition. She reached for him, her trembling hand inching closer. Just as their fingers touched, the darkness behind him roared, a guttural sound that shook the house to its core. The shadow surged forward, its tendrils wrapping around Jack's legs, yanking him back. "No!" Jack screamed, gripping Natalie's hand with all his strength. The pull from the mirror was strong, but the darkness was stronger, dragging him further away. His body felt like it was being torn in two, the cold from the mirror clashing with the burning heat of the shadow. "You don't belong here." Natalie's voice was stronger now, filled with defiance. Her grip tightened around Jack's hand, and for a moment, he felt a surge of energy like her will to escape was flowing through him. With a primal roar, Jack pulled harder, his entire body straining against the shadow. The darkness shrieked, a sound so piercing it made his ears ring. The house trembled violently, the walls cracking, the ceiling splintering as if the entire structure was about to collapse. And then, with a final, desperate tug, Natalie's body broke free from the mirror. She tumbled into Jack's arms, her form light and cold, like mist given shape. The instant she was free, the mirror shattered, the shards flying outward in a blinding explosion of light. The darkness recoiled, writhing and screaming as the light filled the hallway. It thrashed against the walls, its formless body dissolving into smoke. The oppressive weight lifted, and the house fell silent. Jack collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. Natalie knelt beside him, her figure flickering like a fading candle. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, they were calm, filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice soft, almost a sigh. "You've set me free." Before Jack could respond, her form began to dissolve, her body breaking apart into shimmering particles of light. She rose slowly, the light swirling around her like a gentle breeze. And then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, she was gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of ocean air. Jack sat there in the rubble of the hallway, the coldness of the house replaced by an eerie warmth. The front door, once locked, now hung open, revealing the soft glow of dawn outside. He didn't know how long he'd been there, or how he had survived, but one thing was clear: the house had let him go. As Jack staggered to his feet and stepped outside, he turned for one last look at the house. The windows were dark, the structure lifeless. But just as he started to walk away, he heard it again, the faintest sound of water splashing, carried on the wind. It wasn't over. Not entirely. Somewhere, deep within the house, the darkness remained waiting for its next visitor. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Any coincidences with real events or characters are accidental.